Komið sæl og verið velkomin í Fréttir vikunnar með Snorra Másinni ritstjóra. Að þessu sinni erum við snemma á ferðinni á miðvikudegi og líkt föstudögum eins og venjulega. Og það er sérstök ástæða fyrir því við erum með sérstakan gest, engan annan en Matthew Ridley, heimsþekktan rithöfund og blaðamann, sem var hér á Íslandi í tengslum við fund á vegum rannsóknarmiðstöðvar samfélags- og efnahagsmál. Við erum að fara inn í mergjað viðtal við Ridley kórónuveiruna meðal annars og hvaðan hún kom. En líka það hvað umfjöllun kórónuveiruna og viðbrögðin við kórónuveirunni segja samfélag okkar og stjórnarhætti. Þetta er mjög áhugaverður maður. Hver er þetta? Hver er Matt Ridley? Kunna einhverjir að spyrja og ég ætla að segja ykkur það. En ég ætla líka að nefna það lauslega hér í upphafi að Fréttir vikunnar er vikulegu fréttaþáttur með einföld grunngildi sem þið þekkið, ást og ættjörðu, ást og sannleika. Og þessi þáttur er í farsælu samstarfi við öflug íslensk fyrirtæki. Á meðal fyrirtækja í þeim efnum er Happy Hydrate. Það er mín leið í alvöru. Það tryggja mér sölt og steinefni sem maður þarf. Sérstaklega maður er að fara í sánu, maður er að hreyfa sig, þá þarf maður sölt og steinefni af því maður svitnar ykkur út sem það er að koma aftur inn. Þetta er lítil bréf, þægileg, beint út í vatn, klaka, hrista, svo halandi drykkur. Og ég alvörunni held að ég finni mun og ég er ekki að ljúga, ég held að maður í alvörunni þurfi þetta og ég er að drekka þetta. Ég mæli að prófa Happy Hydrate. Gæti verið að það sé það sem þið þurfið. Annað fyrirtæki er Þorgrímsson. Þorgrímsson er mín byggingarvöruverslun. Menn verða átt að segja á veislunni sem er í þessari búð ef þú ert að leita gæðabyggingarefni, hvort sem það eru panelar eða eitthvað á veggið, í flísar í eldhúsið, korkur, parkett, hljóðveistapælingar, hljóðveistin hér er í búið Þorgrímsson. Þá færðu hvergi betri og vandari þjónustu á betra verði en í Þorgrímsson, þannig í alvörunni farðu að skoða dótið í ármúla. Matt Ridley er blaðamaður, viðskiptamaður, stjórnmálamaður, en fyrst og fremst er hann margverðlaunaður metsöluhöfundur sem hefur selt meira en milljón bækur á fleiri en 30 tungumálum. Ridley er menntaður dýrafræðingur með doktorsgráðu í heimspeki. Hann er 1000 þæla smiður þegar kemur að því að skoða mál út frá vitsmunalegu sjónarhorni og bækur hans telja er á vel á annan tug. Þær eru allt frá kynhegðun, eðlisávísun, erfðafræði til viðskiptafrelsis, nýsköpunar, loftslagsbreytinga. Þetta er allt sviðið. Síðasta bók hans hefur vakið gífulega athygli og það er bókin Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. Það er að segja leitin að upprunanum, eins og við köllum það hér á Íslandi. Leitin að uppruna kórónuveirunnar. Hvaðan kemur kórónuveiran? Þessa bók skrifar Matt Ridley í samstarfi við Alina Chan sem er vísindamaður og niðurstaðan er sú að Ridley, Chan og auðvitað fullt af öðrum vísindamönnum hallast þau því að COVID-19 sem hefur drepið tæplega 30 milljónir manna hafi átt upptök sín á rannsóknarstofu og ratað þaðan í menn. Ekki frá dýri í mann á einhvers konar markaði eins og sagt hefur verið, heldur að upprunnin sé á rannsóknarstofu. Og þetta er auðvitað ótrúlegt ef rétt reynist, af því að þessi uppruni veirunnar er ekki mjög mikið til umræðu. Ef fólk efast opinberu frásögnina er gjarnan sagt að það séu bara einhvers konar samsæriskenningasmiðir. En Matt Ridley er ekki samsæriskenningasmiður, hann er ekki fulltrúi jaðarsins í umræðinni. Við erum ekki að tala bara einhvern hérna heima í tölvunni að skrifa upptök kórónuveirunnar og segja bara eitthvað. Matt tekur vísindaleg vinnubrögð afar alvarlega, enda hefur hann fengist við slík störf áratugum saman og orðspor hans er undir. Hann er sannarlega hluti í einhverjum skilningi af stofnanakerfi bresk samfélags. Hann hefur skrifað fyrir rótgróna fjölmiðla, hann var í 8 ár með sæti í lágvaradeild breska þingsins, hann er virkur þátttakandi í samfélagsumræðinu og hann þykir marktækur sem slíkur. Þess vegna hafa hans skoðanir, hafa hans rannsóknir og hans athuganir töluverða vikt á þessu sviði og þær hafa haft töluverð áhrif allan heim, til marks það af mörg hundruð hlaðarstáttum sem góðvinur ritstjórans og sálfræðingurinn Jordan Peterson hefur birt, er viðtalið hjá Jordan Peterson við Matt Ridley 4. vinsælasta hlaðarsviðtal sem Jordan Peterson hefur tekið. Það hafa fleiri en 5 milljónir horft á þetta viðtal á YouTube sem er alvöru áhorf á langt hlaðarsviðtal. Með öðrum orðum, verk Matt Ridley hafa breytt umræðinni uppruna kórónuveirunnar alþjóðlega. Þó því Íslandi megi líklega líta svo á að sú umræða sé rétt að byrja ef hún þá byrjar. Hvaðan kom þessi veira sem lagði allt í rúst í nokkur ár? Það er ekki aukaatriði, en umræðan hér hefur að mestu svona einskorðast við fyrirsagnir að tilraunastofukenningin sé útilokuð og þá vísaði, já, kannski skoðun bandarísku leyniþjónustunnar þá stundina, En meira segja slíkum stofnunum ber ekki saman, þær fara fram og tilbaka. Segja ég þetta sé úr tilraunastofu eða geti alls ekki verið að hallist að þessu, hallist að hinu. Þannig að okkar hlutverk að skoða gögnin. Að minnstakosti þá allan að ræða við þá sem hafa skoðað gögnin. Og í þessum þætti erum við að gera það. Við erum að ræða við Matt Ridley. Auk þessa, auk kórónuveirunnar erum við auðvitað að ræða margt annað. Við erum að ræða stöðu Íslands, stöðu Bretlands í evrópsku samhengi. Hann studdi Brexit mjög einarlega. Hann er að ræða stöðu okkar gagnvart því. Við ræðum Evrópusambandi, við ræðum misfellir í frjálslyndu lýðræði nútímans, meðal annars í ljósi þessa alls með COVID-19. Þannig að þetta er mjög gott samtal við Matt Ridley. Gjörðu svo vel. Þið getið fundið viðtalið textalauslega á YouTube. Þar getið stilt á texta og þýðingu. Welcome, Matt Ridley, to Iceland.
Thank you very much. I love coming to Iceland.
Yeah, have you been here before?
I've been here many times, actually. I enjoy coming here for fishing or for bird watching or for business, actually.
Fly fisher and salmon?
I love fly fishing for salmon. The rivers are so beautiful. And
they're quite special
here. Scenery, it's just fantastic.
We have a huge debate around that these days because of the salmon industry and the effects on the rivers.
Salmon farms. I hope you don't allow the salmon farms to spoil
No, we have this huge debate, the natural debate about preserving nature and then, of course, making money. It's a classic one, but people really differ.
Yeah. No, well, I won't try and
step in,
interfere in your own debate.
No, so you're here, Matt. You for our listeners, you're a quite renowned public intellectual by now. You've written several books on various topics about evolution, biology, human instincts, species, genes, genetic codes, prosperity, and then in later years more about trade and innovation and optimism about society as a whole and how we're evolving. Then in the last few years you've been quite focused on COVID and its origins and I suppose the whole theme. You've written a new book. It's called The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. You basically have two theories in this realm. It's the lab leak one, and then it's the natural occurring one in the wet market. You're leaning towards the lab leak one. What's the thing there? Do you have a theory?
Yes. So I collaborated to write this book with a brilliant young scientist called Alina Chan, who's a Canadian scientist at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT. And she had begun to suspect in the spring of 2020 that we could not rule out a laboratory accident because there were features of the virus that were very surprising. It was extraordinarily well adapted to infecting human beings in a way that a new spillover from an animal usually is not. And for various other reasons, the fact that it occurred in the one city in the world that's had a lab specializing in collecting and manipulating exactly this kind of virus.
An interesting coincidence.
That was a coincidence that needed investigating. So unlike most scientists, she was open-minded about that. She didn't want to rule out the lab leak prematurely, but she wasn't convinced. And that was roughly where I had got to too. At first I ruled it out. I said, no, come on, it's not very likely. These things are much more often natural than artificial. But I gradually came around to the view that we did need to investigate that. We eventually decided to join forces, me as a writer, her as a scientist, in investigating this matter, and wrote a book which came out in 2021, which does not conclude that it was definitely a lab leak, but does lean that way. Since the book came out, that was the first edition, we then brought out a paperback edition the following year, but since then, all sorts of evidence has emerged that makes the lab leak theory more and more plausible. And at the same time, other evidence has emerged that makes the wet market theory less and less plausible. And basically, one has a mountain of evidence now, and the other has no evidence at all.
There are so many. There are a lot of factors that counter into when one is, trying to convince others of the obvious truth that it was a natural incident, and then the other side, it's the lab leak. And normal people, they do not have the time to research it themselves and get into these things. are they left with the option of just picking a side to trust and picking someone, a scientist or writer that they trust, because then they go ahead and do the work, because that's like traditionally how we have approached science. I know nothing about physics or about how my car works. I trust the science, but then the scientists start to get quite political sometimes suddenly. Like what kind of spiritual times are we living in these terms? Like what's happening here? What's the dynamic?
Yeah, it's a very important moment for science because, like you, I love science. I'm a huge fan of it. I think vaccination is a terrific technology for saving lives. I think genetic manipulation, biotechnology is a vital part of biomedicine, but also of agriculture. I'm not coming at this as an anti-vax, anti-science person. But I do think that if it's possible or likely that this was an accident in a laboratory, science would be best investigating it and admitting it, and then changing its procedures to make sure it doesn't happen again, rather than digging in its heels and saying, no, we don't think that's what happened. But I've been debating scientists on this who literally do not want it to be investigated. They're not saying, I've investigated and I think it's wrong, I don't think it is a lab leak. They're saying, it's better we do not know. That is literally what a senior scientist said to me. Now, that's terrible. That's a simply appalling way for any scientist to argue. There's 28 million people dead as a result of this. If so, it's the worst industrial accident that's ever happened.
Yeah.
And you cannot, you wouldn't walk away from an airplane crash saying, better we don't investigate in case it annoys the airline.
Yeah.
But what they're saying here is better we don't investigate in case it annoys the Chinese government, in case it annoys the scientific profession. But I'm meeting that objection all the time. And that has made me very disillusioned, not with science as a philosophy, but with science as an institution.
Yeah, as a class maybe of people as well. Should one be afraid of the Chinese government in this case? Is it, there are threatening entities in this world that people have a reason to be afraid of. And as you describe, there is a hesitancy in people of delving into this matter, maybe because of the Chinese government. I personally, I'm not afraid of the Chinese government. I couldn't see what they could do to me. Maybe I'm naive, but what are people afraid of?
I think it's not so much fear as interest. In other words, Chinese investment in science, in scientific journals, for example, where they've been very supportive of some of the scientific journals, has meant that quite a lot of Western scientists, Western universities, etc., are dependent or reliant on Chinese money.
Some would say they've been co-opted.
And that makes them inevitably a little bit co-opted. Mm. So that's a real phenomenon that you have to take into account. Now, I'm not in that position. Alina Chan, although her ancestry is Chinese, is not in that position. We don't, either of us have to worry that our livelihood is threatened by whatever outcome here. So I've got no vested interest in a lab outcome, but I've got no vested interest in a natural outcome either. And that's why I think it's fallen to people like me. And by the way, our book is called The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, not the origin of COVID-19. So what we're arguing is, here's an extraordinary story about the people who dug out the relevant information. And a lot of these people are amateurs. I really want to emphasize just how much we have relied in this case on a series of people who've been beavering away on the internet, finding, for example, the password that gets you into a Chinese website where you can find obscure theses, downloading them. That was what a man called the Seeker did from India. A brilliant Spaniard who worked out exactly which caves the Chinese scientists had visited to collect bats and which bats they'd collected in which cave. A brilliant New Zealand-based Frenchman who... These are not scientists. These are just amateur investigators. And they've made much more contribution, unpaid, to this story than professional academics.
What do you think happens there when the pandemic breaks out and the world is in complete crisis? And then you have quite quickly a smooth and simple institutional narrative that comes to being, which is like, this is a natural incident in this market, and a lab leak is not possible. That didn't happen. And many people were just ready to claim that just fully without really knowing it, without really having been there, without really having, looked at the data. What drives people to be so certain in their, their belief, their claims, while you really can't know, but you still just stated 100% securely that it wasn't a lab leak. You have numerous, just in Icelandic media, we have numerous headlines, just this wasn't a lab leak. Yep. Just like stating it 100%. And then like I've written articles, maybe it was a lab leak. There's certain evidence that points to it. There are certain books, it's certain research that points to it. So like, how can people be so sure? Is it like, are they just sure they won't meet repercussions of having been wrong, or what do you think?
There was a scientific paper published by 5 authors in Nature Medicine in March 2020 called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. This was enormously influential. It was very influential on me. It caused me to go around saying to colleagues in the British Parliament that they could rule out a lab leak, because this paper said, for the following reasons, it is not plausible that this came from any kind of research-related activity. Now, when I eventually got around to examining the arguments they'd made, I thought, hang on, these are a bit flimsy. They were saying things like, if we'd done it in a lab, we'd have done it better than this. Well, it's pretty darn good. It's killing people on a huge scale.
And very contagious.
And very infectious. But worse than that, after a year or two, through congressional inquiries and freedom of information by journalists in America, we found the correspondence among those 5 scientists who wrote that paper, the private correspondence, in which they were saying the very opposite of what their paper said. One of the lead author, Christian Andersen, wrote to his friends, I still think it's friggin' likely that it did happen as a result of a lab. And another one says, it was pre-adapted from the get-go. And a third one says, given the research they were doing there, this is highly plausible. Now, they've since said, yes, but we changed our mind when we saw new evidence. What new evidence? And then we've got their correspondence from after the paper was published, and they hadn't changed their minds. They were writing to each other saying, I still think.
And these are leaked emails. Yeah.
These are leaked emails, leaked Slack messages that have come forward as a result of congressional investigations. Now, I think publishing a scientific paper that says the opposite of what you think is scientific misconduct, frankly, and that paper should be retracted. It's a disgrace that it hasn't been. Its arguments don't stand up anyway, as I say. They make arguments that have since been shown to be completely wrong. But it was written as an attempt to shut down the debate. We now know that. In fact, they said that in their messages. They said, look, given the shit show, apologies for my language, that would happen if anyone blamed China for even accidental release, we better not say that this is possible. And another replies, I hate it when science gets political, but it's impossible not to. So they were being political here. They were trying to do something to close down the debate for political reasons. Now, that isn't the way scientists should behave. It's for me, it's the most shocking episode in the 40 or 50 years that I've spent covering science as a philosophy and an institution.
Yes, and it must leave one, as you said, disillusioned with the whole industry, the whole complex of institutional science as it presents itself right now. There are many other factors, not just in this COVID, where they obviously take like some unclear geopolitical implications into account and then change their science out with regard to that, but also in a number of other domains like sciences. You read the scientific journals and they are quite political in many sense. Like, and it's not just this. Where do we go from here in science? Like, are we going to have a huge reckoning of what science is supposed to be? And are these institutions, the institutions we have, the universities, and the official institution of the states, are they going to become more fair, become less politicized, or is that like also an illusion? Aren't they just going to get worse? And do we then need new institutions formed on the internet or whatever, where we really have freedom of information?
Well, I think this episode, coming on, as you say, others, including some of the climate debates, where there was very clearly a lot of motivated reasoning going on, a lot of propaganda that was masquerading as science, has left people like me very distrustful of not all science by any means. There's plenty of good objective science going on out there, but has left me distrustful of some of this politicized science that is happening and that is coming from institutions. And it's a problem that's got much worse in recent years. The infection of politics has got into it. How do we put it right? Well, I think the problem stems from the monolithic nature of scientific funding. That in America, for example, in this field of virology, pretty well everybody was funded by one institution, the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, the head of which, Anthony Fauci, was in post for 32 years and was the highest paid official in the US government, bar none. Now, that's not healthy because he was very clearly expressing opinions on things and you knew which side of the argument you should be on to please him and his lieutenants. Now, in the old days, the beauty of science was that it was fragmented and decentralized. It happened in lots of different universities all over the world. And if Professor A put forward a theory and Professor B didn't like Professor A, he went for him. And he said, this is rubbish and that's... And they had an argument at a conference and they both got funded to do their research to prove each other was wrong. And one of them turned out to be right and the other turned out to be wrong. I'm not taking sides between Professor A and Professor B here.
Of course not.
But that's what we've lost. We've got now everybody on the singing from the same song sheet because of this centralized funding mechanism. It's the same in the UK. Yes, we've got, in the medical field, we've got the government, but we've also got the Wellcome Trust, a very big funder of biomedical research, but it does not differ one jot from the government in the way that it sees the world. And so you've seen this, for example, in Alzheimer's research, it got rather stuck because it got stuck on one hypothesis, and anyone who came up with an alternative hypothesis wasn't funded, wasn't allowed to publish, etc., etc. So
accused of misinformation.
Yes, exactly, accused of misinformation. So it becomes more like a church than a science.
Yeah,
it becomes dogmatic.
Yeah, there are people who describe the institutional narrative as something coming from like a cathedral. It's religious in some sense. It's turned religious.
Well, yes,
it has religious traits.
Exactly, yeah. and there's a phenomenon called confirmation bias, which is that when you have a theory, you look for evidence that supports it. You don't look for evidence that doesn't support it. You should do. You should want to actually seek out challenging a bit of evidence that would knock your theory down. But nobody does that.
No, are you afraid that you're not doing it yourself with the lab leak theory, maybe, or it could be? Or?
Indeed, there's an element of that, of course. Yeah. But what keeps me honest, what keeps everyone honest, is the fact that other people will challenge you.
Yeah.
And I've been challenged tremendously, And so just this week, I had a debate with a virologist in New York, where he presented the argument that it came from a wet market, and I presented the argument that it came from a lab, and we both were very polite to each other, very civil. It was an excellent debate. Yeah. An hour and a half we went at it, and
but could you guys work together to just like to get closer to a result? Like, do you know what I mean? Like how is it? Like I'm not sure that's what people should be aiming for. That people work together from the opposing sides, but still, is it realistic that you're still able to go to the other side if the necessary evidence.
Absolutely. There's plenty of room in this debate for people who come into it saying, look, I don't care whether it's a lab leak or a natural occurrence. I want to dig out all the evidence for the market and all the evidence for the lab leak. But the people who've been pushing the wet market, and by the way, they don't include the Chinese authorities anymore, and they don't include the leading coronavirologist in America, Ralph Baric. He's given up on that theory. I mean, they've given,
the wet market theory.
The wet market theory is now just a handful of people are still pushing this. They keep saying, look at the wet market, look at the wet market, look at the evidence that they might have had raccoon dogs there, look at the evidence that the cases cluster around the market. Well, of course they do, because that's where they looked. But, and so on. They don't say, let me come and look at your evidence for the lab leak and assess that. And the lab leak people don't say, well, let me come and look at the wet market evidence. Actually, they do that a bit more. But so you're right. This is what we need. Is it people investigating each other's theories as well as their own?
Well, you think it was a lab leak, right?
I now think it was not almost certainly. I wouldn't quite go that far because, there is still a horrendous lack of information from the Chinese. They really could have been much, much more transparent. But I think it's very likely, I think I would put it that way, that it was a laboratory accident that led to this pandemic.
Yeah.
Mainly because of a couple of documents that emerged in 2021 that really did show that they were planning an experiment to make what basically would be a pretty close blueprint of this virus.
Make it in scientific sense to research it, or in some other dubious sense? What's your thinking there?
Well, the program of research was ostensibly about identifying pathogens with pandemic potential. So identifying viruses that could cause the next pandemic. Now, they'd started out with SARS, because that was the outbreak in 2002-03 in southern China, which they were investigating, and which was a natural outbreak. There's nobody's in doubt about that, although it then did leak from labs several times after that. For a long time, what they did was go and find viruses in bats that resembled the SARS virus, and then test them in the lab to see how well they infected human cells or humanized mice with human genes in them. And that was risky enough. That could have led to an accident. They were doing it at the wrong biosafety level, so that's a black mark against that set of experiments. But then what they did was pick out the spike gene from some of these wild bat viruses and put it in with a backbone from a different virus so as to make a chimera, a hybrid virus, and test that on human cells.
To take some properties from one virus and mix it from another to another. And the spike gene was the property that made it so easy to transmit into humans, or...
Well, they all have a spike gene,
yeah.
But depending on the exact sequence of the spike gene, depends how well it infects human beings. Yes. And some of those experiments with chimeras resulted in new viruses that did not exist in nature that were 10,000 times more infectious in humanized mice. Now, that's a really dangerous experiment. And again, some of these experiments, not the mouse infections, but the cell infections, were being done at biosafety level 2, which is basically, it's not much different from the conditions you and I are sitting in here. I might be wearing a mask and gloves, but that's about it. So now we're talking really dangerous, risky experiments that are not going to tell you very much anyway.
With basically like biology classroom safety level.
Right. Yeah. But the defense that these virologists have is, yes, but we were looking at SARS. We weren't looking at these viruses, which are 10 to 25% different from SARS, until this document came forward, which said that from 2019 onwards, we're going to broaden our approach because we want to eventually produce a vaccine that'll work against all these kinds of viruses. So next, we're going to look for viruses that are 10 to 25% different.
From SARS, the original one, which we had in 2002, which just died out, was all right. They could have been researching that and improving.
So now they're looking at the cousins of SARS.
Yeah.
And this one, SARS-CoV-2, is 24% different in the key part of the genome. So it's exactly the kind of one they were looking at. And then they said, And to make it easier to grow these viruses in the lab, we're going to put a special feature into the middle of the spike gene at the so-called S1 to S2 junction, which is a thing called a furin cleavage site. Now, you don't really need to know what it is or how it works. You just need to know that SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID, is the only SARS-like virus that has ever turned up among more than 800 that we've looked at that has a furin cleavage site in. So it's like saying we're going to put a horn on a horse in one lab, in one country, in one place, as an experiment in 1 year, and a year later, a unicorn walks down the street in that city. That's a pretty surprising coincidence. Even more surprising was that when they published the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 for the first time, the Chinese lab did, they didn't mention the furin cleavage site. Well, that's like describing a unicorn without mentioning the horn.
Yes.
It's the most striking feature about this virus. It's the reason we had a pandemic. It makes the virus way more infectious. And they'd been doing similar experiments with these sites. So I'm sorry to get a bit technical there, but
of course we have to get into these details. But in a broader sense, if this is true, that this was certainly a lab leak, and there is a possibility to ascertain it, to be certain, like if people really had the interest of really going into this and researching it, investigating it, then we could. It's possible to know. Then, like, where will we get our truth from? The U.S. government has gone back and forth, and the intelligence agencies have, in one point in time, said something about that it's probably like not a lab leak. Then the next year, maybe it was a lab leak. Then we have, if it was the Department of Energy at some point that said it was a lab leak or something. I remember various news reports about this going back and forth.
Yeah, the reason for the Department of Energy's involvement, because it does actually oversee a number of molecular biology labs, has done ever since the Genome Project. So it is actually a very relevant agency in this respect. FBI has come out and said it thinks it was a lab leak. Some of the other agencies have said they think it wasn't. So America's got all these different intelligence agencies, and they don't like sharing their working in public. They don't like saying what the evidence they're basing it on is, because that might give away some of their methods.
Yeah, but it's like, if you have a discrepancy in that like, why is the president just not like, look, if it was a lab leak, then that has serious implications. Like, how can people be just like casual about this?
Well, this is people say to me, look, it doesn't really matter whether it was a lab leak or natural, because what we should do is tighten up lab safety and tighten up wet market safety, right? What's the problem? We'll do both. But not only are we doing neither. There's been a bit of a crackdown on the wet markets in China, but not much of one.
Okay.
The Chinese don't think it came out of a wet market, so they're not bothered doing that at the moment. But what there hasn't been is any improved regulation of laboratory safety. We don't know what labs are doing anywhere in the world. It's unlike the nuclear era. We don't even have the information about what's going on. And the World Health Organization was saying as early as 2006, there's a good chance that the next pandemic will start in a lab. There's so much more virology going on, and it's so risky that actually it's more likely to come out of a lab next time than out of the wild. They were saying that as early as 2006. They're not saying it anymore since the pandemic started. Why? Because the World Health Organization is terrified of China and doesn't like saying anything that annoys China. But far from learning the lesson that we need to be a lot more careful about what's going on in virology laboratories around the world, the world is saying, no, we don't talk about that anymore. So the world is more dangerous now than it was before the pandemic.
That's amazing. And this effect China has, like this maybe we can call it a fear or hesitancy of organizations coming out with information that's unfortunate for China. What is, like, geopolitically, what is the position of China just right now? Like, how do you see this interplaying? If the virus came from there, they have huge investments in Western institutions and research institutions. Are they deliberate about their plans taking over the West. How do you see it? Like also as an analyst in a more broader sense, not like only in this. Áður við höldum áfram með viðtalið við Matt Ridley nefni hér stuttlega ritstjórinn í farsælu samstarfi við öflug íslensk fyrirtæki. Hlustaðu vel, þegar ég segi aldrei að sama fyrirtæki mín, ég aldrei að endurtaka mig til þess Reykjavík Foto. Ertu að búa til efni? Þarftu að vera með góða mynd, gott hljóð, góð ljós. Það raunverulega ótrúlegt hvað að gera árið 2024. Það sem ég að gera með dóti úr Reykjavík Foto. Þetta sanngjarnt verðlagt, þetta ódýrt dót, þetta alvöru góð verslun. Farið Reykjavík Foto og þarftu að halda. Jafnvel þú þarft ekki að halda, þú mynd finna eitthvað við þitt hæfi. Reykjavík Foto. Myntkaup annað fyrirtæki. Trump var skotinn á dögunum og Bitcoin rauk upp. Margir segja að þetta sé stöðuleikinn í óstöðum heimi. Ég ætla ekki að taka afstöðu til slíkra fullyrðinga, en við lítum svo á að Bitcoin séu áhugaverður eignaflokkur. Peningamenn margir farnir að vera mildari gagnvart þessum eignaflokki. Það áhugaverð þróun. Ef þú ert áhugasamur mæli ég sjálfur með að leita til myntkaupa. Myntkaup.is. Við séum stundum örugga og einfalda leiðin til að kaupa Bitcoin. Við ætlum að fara aftur í viðtalið, en fyrst stutt tilkynning.
Tölum tilfinningu. Tilfinningu sem gagntekur okkur. Tölum svo Lexus.
Well, if you read some excellent books that have been written about how China tries to influence the world, about what it does through its various institutions in the West whose job is to influence policy towards China and so on, and this the diplomacy that goes behind that, then yes, there's a lot of very deliberate attempts to influence the debate in domestic political terms in countries like the UK, the US, and presumably Iceland as well.
Yeah.
And so, it's not paranoid or nutty to say that China is constantly trying to insert its view into Western political discourse. That it's got a lot of leverage in doing so is caused by the fact that it has huge financial investments in the West, and it can dangle those investments in front of people and say, here's why you should toe the line on certain subjects, whether it's the Uyghurs or Hong Kong or Taiwan or the COVID issue. That doesn't mean that everything China does in the West is dubious. Of course, there's lots of generous and helpful and mutually beneficial deals to be done with China. But just to give you a very specific example, early February 2020, just as the pandemic is beginning to spread outside China, and noises are starting to be made about a possible laboratory leak as the cause of it, the Chinese property company Evergrande dangled a $115 million donation to Harvard Medical School, which is an enormous donation for one institution. And the head of Harvard Medical School contacted Anthony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, to say, before we finalize this donation, the head of Evergrande, or the senior executives at Evergrande, want to have a conversation with you about US policy towards this debate about the origin of the virus. Now, I wasn't in the room. I don't know what they said, but it's not difficult to imagine that this check was being waived and there were conditions being suggested about how the US should go easy on speculation about a lab leak, or the money wouldn't be forthcoming. Now, it would be very nice if Anthony Fauci would come forward and say, no, that wasn't what we talked about, you've got the wrong end of the stick. But that's the kind of thing that journalists are investigating and should be investigating.
And that's one quite like an obvious way to exercise influence. That's money, but like how afraid should we be? Like, should we regard China as like a dangerous authoritarian, entity that we should like really be watching out for, or because U.S. foreign policy hasn't been like very hawkish against China like in the past 20 years. It's been cooperative in some sense. it's very strict towards Russia right now. But if anyone were receiving comparable funds from Russia for research projects in the US, I'm sure that there would be a lot more talk about it. So it's although China is a much more powerful entity, how do you think we should regard China? And in your research, how has the Chinese, environment, how have you perceived it in terms of, of course, freedom of speech and whatever, freedom of research, in general, the culture there in these issues? How do you perceive China?
I try and see it in historical terms. Under Mao Zedong, China was a very hostile force to the West and to overall global stability. Deng Xiaoping came along and reformed China economically, but not politically. So it remained a very authoritarian one-party state. But in terms of what you could do as a businessman setting up a business, it was suddenly very, very free indeed, rather more free than a lot of the West, where you were tied down in petty regulations, which didn't exist in China. Yes. So if you wanted to start a business, invent something, you were off to the races pretty quickly in China. And that resulted in a spectacular period of economic growth in China and a lot of, as I say, economic freedom. And
just like America in the good years.
Yeah, exactly. And right up to Hu Jintao. And then Xi Jinping comes along and he starts to be much more authoritarian economically as well as politically, and starts to say, this is what we're going to do, this is a favoured company, this isn't, etc., etc. And if, yes, you're a private company, but you have to, when you go to work in the West, you have to do the Chinese state's bidding. There's much more of that. And it took us a while in the West to realise that things had changed under Xi Jinping. I think that's the way to think about it.
Yeah.
And we went on thinking we were dealing with a gradually westernizing country when we weren't. We were dealing with a country that was becoming much more Maoist.
Yes, and essentially maybe each Chinese company you're dealing with is in some sense part of the CCP. It could be argued.
Yeah, and I sometimes say to virologists who say nothing particularly wrong with what they were doing at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I say, look, does it not bother you that we now know there was People's Liberation Army scientists working in that lab? What's that all about? We do not have the U.S. Army working in Harvard Medical School. No. The collaboration with the army in particular, as well as everybody's, the Communist Party is obviously involved in every institution.
Very intertwined.
But exactly.
In a broader sense, the implications for Western democracy, the draconian measures, at some regard, with the COVID and the virus itself when it hit us, as well as quite, extensive measures against free speech by social media companies, by media companies, by official entities. Did it shock you how things turned out, and how the nominally liberal democracies turned out to be quite not so liberal or democratic in certain senses, as I saw it, at least in COVID, and then increasingly in other aspects as well these days? Have you also been disillusioned by politics in general and the principal freedoms of our societies?
Yes, I'm shocked, disillusioned, and increasingly so. So when it all blew up in March of 2020 and we were told to lock down, I thought, oh gosh, well, I suppose they must know what they're doing. But it quickly became apparent that this was a policy made on the hoof in a hurry with a lot of China envy built into it, by the way. Oh, they did it in Wuhan, we can do it here. And it threw out of the window decades of planning for pandemic prevention, and it ignored the fact, and by the way, I think if we'd admitted to ourselves that this was possibly a laboratory-derived virus at the start, we'd have realised that these measures are not going to work. Lockdowns are not going to stop the spread of the virus, as indeed they didn't. But, when I thought it was just a couple of weeks of lockdown to suppress the curve and then we'd get back to normal, I thought, fair enough. But when it went on for weeks and months, and then, of course, when Sweden didn't follow the herd, but did its own voluntary measures, encouraging people to do social distancing thing, but no closure of schools, no compulsory masking, no compulsory house arrest for people. And by the way, in the UK, we were all locked up in our homes in beautiful weather in that spring, and we now know that an airborne virus like COVID is not a threat out of doors, but it is a threat indoors. Yeah. It's completely the wrong way around, that policy.
But it was probably regarded as misinformation at the time to state that. Yeah.
So thank God for Sweden. And Johan Anderberg has written a very, very good book about this that documents exactly how much pressure the Swedes came under. Yeah. And when people say to me, yes, but Swedes are different, they all live alone in the forest or something. Well, A, they don't. Most of them live in Stockholm. Yeah. And B, that wasn't what you said at the time. At the time, there were all these dire warnings in the press about how Sweden was going to have an absolute catastrophe. And then to put the icing on the cake, we wake up about a year ago and find through the work of Michael Schellenberger, Matt Ridley and people, that Facebook and other organizations have been deliberately censoring certain people on the internet on behalf of the US government. I mean, where did that come from as a policy? It's truly shocking, actually, the amount of authoritarianism. And what's even more shocking is how popular it is. So, in the UK...
All Western countries love it.
When they were being really draconian, stay in your home, don't do this, don't do that, the police will arrest you if they see you in the park, the popularity of governments went up. Now, politicians notice things like that. They think, this is rather fun.
Yeah.
I get to play dictator and be popular.
Yeah, that's a nice mix, maybe a toxic one. And then since we have, Center for Digital Hate, they are exacerbating these efforts still today. And then they just find new subjects to censor and that are uncomfortable for the
misinformation industry is very, very pernicious, I think, because 90% of the time it's pushing misinformation itself. But even when it's not, it's highly selective about what it describes as.
You were talking about the pressure that Sweden faced. We live in an increasingly globalized world where you have these multinational entities that come to play and that want certain nation states to behave. We have the European Union. You guys left the European Union, of course, famously. We still have people here in Iceland that are very convinced that we have to join the European Union to prosper economically and such. A few words from you on that, the Brexit thing in Iceland in terms of that, and just like also this question you also talked about it in terms of the science, this centralization or decentralization, like what's going to work better for people just to rule their own place or to always retreat to this international power that they can just hand everything over to without having to be responsible themselves.
Well, I'm a huge fan of international collaboration at the government-to-government level or the people-to-people level. What I'm not a fan of is international agencies that have the power to pass laws into my own country, which is what the European Union became. And Britain took the decision to leave. It was an extremely painful and controversial issue, still is. It's divided us like a civil war has in many ways, and that's very uncomfortable.
Do you feel it? Is it a hateful situation in some?
There are people who won't speak to those who voted leave. I don't think there are people who voted leave who won't speak to those who voted remain. But it is still a very painful issue, and both have a point. Okay, now looking back, the leavers are right that it did not cause an economic catastrophe. I mean, Britain's done slightly better than France and Germany economically since it left. Its exports to the rest of the world are up. There has been no complete collapse of our economy, which was what we were told by the Remain campaign repeatedly during the referendum. Okay, so the leavers are absolutely right that the catastrophe didn't happen, but the Remainers are right that it hasn't led to a golden age of economic growth outside. Why? Because we didn't take advantage of having left to then repeal a bunch of legislation, completely change the way we do things, open up to the world and become much more internationalist. We did a little bit of that. We have knocked off, the tariffs on tomatoes, for example. We don't grow very many tomatoes in the UK, so why do we have a tariff to protect our tomato growing industry? That doesn't make sense. But we had to have one when we were in the European Union. Yeah. We had to have a tariff on rice because there's about 8 people in southern Italy who grow rice, and they need protecting from the Indians or the Bangladeshis.
Interesting.
Or something. So to move outside a protectionist fortress is a good thing, but you've got to do more to take advantage of it, and that's what we're not doing and what we haven't done. The historical perspective that I see on this is that the European Union's mistake was this obsession with harmonization, with saying the rules have got to be the same in every part of the continent. But that's not how a free trade zone works. A free trade zone works by, California saying it's going to do things one way and New York saying it's going to do things another way, and then you find, well, actually, A, there's an experiment, and B, that makes California good at some things and New York good at other things. And so, the Italian city-states, the Song Empire in China 1,000 years ago, these were examples of places where, yes, they're all in the same country, but no, they're not doing the same thing. And that was what Europe was so good at, and why it had the Industrial Revolution, because you had France and Germany and Italy doing things differently. And if an entrepreneur like Gutenberg, the guy who invented printing, didn't like the rules in one place, he moved to another place. And these people were always doing this. They were hopping across borders to try and find congenial regimes. So that was Europe's secret sauce, was not being harmonized. So the European Union bringing harmonization in as its central policy was, for me, the crucial mistake. And it's resulted in Europe becoming a stagnant economy, just as under the Ming emperors in China became a stagnant economy.
Yes, and that also leads to them being world masters in regulations, and now we have this huge new technology emerging, and the only thing Europe thinks about is how to quell it and stop it in some sense. And
that's America innovates, Europe regulates.
China copies.
And China copies,
exactly. So it would be preposterous, in my view, for Icelanders to even consider joining a regulatory union as the European Union is. We now already have certain regulations we have to meet because of the economic trade union, but yes, it's interesting how Europe has evolved.
Well, geography matters. You're out in the middle of the Atlantic. You're not part of Europe geographically. You literally have the mid-Atlantic line under you, splitting you apart, as we know.
Yes, as we can feel.
And so, your best shot, and to some extent ours, is to be connected with Europe and friends with Europe and collaborating with Europe and trading with Europe, but also with America, but also with Asia. Yeah. And I think you do that very well in Iceland, and I would not give that up if I were you.
We have huge geopolitical questions ahead of us in terms of leaning towards the West or the East, leaning towards America. We have quite turbulent times there.
One of the things that the Remain side used to say in our referendum was Britain is a tiny place, it can't go it alone in the world economy. There's just no future for somewhere as small as Britain. Well, we're a heck of a lot bigger than Iceland.
And we're okay.
And you're doing fine.
One of the richest countries in the world.
Exactly.
I'm going to let you go soon because you have an event to attend. Any final thoughts on this lab leak theory? Because I think it's new to a lot of people who are listening right now, that people have such extensive evidence and things that are pointing towards this lab leak theory, because the other theory was so pervasive. It was such an eternal truth as presented to us by the media at the time. And I probably took part in it. I was working in traditional media at the time, and I in many senses drank the Kool-Aid on a lot of things in COVID, as many did.
Me too.
You don't become disillusioned until a moment hits you in your life when you suddenly start to doubt something, suddenly something starts to seep in. I remember I was always discussing this with my brother, who was he was quite mad about all the measures that were taken and such, and I was just like, don't you just see the models that they are giving us? Don't you see the models? This is what will happen if we don't take these measures. For me, it was just simple. We have these models. We know what will happen if we don't go to these measures. And then, like, not a single model ever came true in any real sense. It was all just thoughts, fabrication, and some, like, and that also got me like. Thinking about science, like how are we using science in this political sense, and that really changed my thinking on this.
I think that we need to learn a very, very strong lesson here about models. The idea that models are science is wrong. I mean, they are not science. They are not the same thing as finding out factual truths about the world. They are attempts to simulate the world, which, if they're looking at complex dynamic systems like an epidemic or a climate or an economy, are hugely unreliable. They either produce a result that's plain wrong by a mile, or if you say, well, hang on, it's not wrong, it's got a huge error bar around it.
Yeah, the trick is always to produce three models, and like one of them will be right.
But if you say, well, our error bar is from 1 to 500, so the fact that it was 2 means we were right. No, sorry, that's a meaningless prediction. So either they're meaningless or they're wrong, these models, 99% of the time. And I think the fetishization of models, as if they were true science when they're not, is a real problem in the modern world. Just to give you a very specific example, the experts put the British government under very strong pressure to lock down in December 21 when the Omicron wave was arriving, and they forecast with their models that if they didn't lock down, by the middle of January there were going to be between 600 and 6,000 deaths per day. That was the range. Are you sure you want Prime Minister to go into a world with that range? In the event, there were 200, and they didn't lock down. So they called their bluff, these modelers, and they were wrong. But even if they were right, what kind of range is that? 600 to 6,000?
Yeah.
It's not a meaningful prediction.
No, it's useless.
And it's wrong. And they placed far too much emphasis on modelling during the pandemic, and I think that's a genuine crime that needs to be investigated.
Do you have a message to those who were skeptical about like every single thread, about everything that was done in COVID, like from the origin to the measures to the discussions to the politics of it to the research of it to the vaccines? Do people need to be careful not to get too polarized, to think like if one thing this person is saying is wrong, like everything must be wrong, therefore exactly. I'm not going to use the vaccines? Like, do people have to be moderate in their approach to this? This
is where, precisely as you say, we have a saying in English that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is good stuff. Vaccination is a really good way of saving lives, particularly on other diseases, and particularly in this case in the elderly. But who's to blame for the loss of faith in scientists and experts here? It's the scientists and experts for being overconfident on their models, overconfident on the need to vaccinate children, overconfident on the fact that it wasn't an airborne virus, which they insisted on for many months at the start. These are the mistakes. The blame doesn't lie with the anti-scientists who are filling up the airwaves now and voting for Robert F. Kennedy or whatever. No. The blame lies with the scientists for damaging their brand by premature certainty on a number of issues. Yeah. But you must be around in your research and in your work, you must be around a lot of people that are like categorically against the COVID vaccine, for example. Like, do you have these discussions? Like, do you believe that it was useful in some sense? Yes, I do. I think it saved a lot of lives, but I think there was over-claiming for it, saying it might prevent transmission, which we now know it didn't, and saying that it might not have side effects, which we now know it did. And the equation, the idea that you should have been giving this vaccine to children is wrong. If it doesn't prevent transmission, there's no point in doing that. And if it has side effects and children are at very low risk from COVID, it really is a very age discriminating virus, much more so than influenza. Then it was a real mistake.
It wasn't worth it.
They should have said, old people, please take it. Middle-aged people, we advise you to take it. Young people, it's up to you, but probably you shouldn't take it.
Comparable to the system we have already with the influenza shots, like
exactly.
People,
that's correct. Actually, it's a very good point.
Yes, Mr. Ridley, it's been a pleasure. At the end, we're going to end this discussion because we've touched on some geopolitics. We touched on Iceland. We touched on the European Union and the authoritarian tendencies we see in Western democracies. It's not a small issue, as you can hear. You've also written about optimism in general. Like, I'm an optimist. I try to be. But for the audience, I get messages about like that aren't quite optimistic about where things are going. Are you? What's the point? What's the point of optimism? Why should we be optimistic about the future? Do we have to be? Is there a reason to be? And also, like, what is the responsibility of each individual just to, play their part and do their thing to build a better future?
I wrote a book called The Rational Optimist, which came out in 2010. Ever since then, people have said to me, you can't still be an optimist. Look at the world. It's a terrible state. Well, actually, no, it's pretty damn good. Sorry about my language. But the average African has seen his chances of dying of malaria or HIV go plummeting in the last 15 years. His chances of being killed in a war go down dramatically. They've also seen their living standards go dramatically up. Their child mortality rates come down. So, if you look at it from the point of view of the poorest people on the planet, these are really good years. Now, the fact that they're not as much fun in the West as they were, that we can't seem to get economic growth going, that
I also think most of the factors,
culture wars and things like that.
Yeah, I think that most of the factors you mentioned are also are actually in some sense going down in the West as well. Like some of them.
Fair enough, but yes, there are problems, and yes, I'm a little less optimistic than I was then about the Western world's ability to hang on to the spirit of enterprise, the sort of thing you talk about individuals needing to do, that enables them to innovate and improve each other's lives. We're more and more obsessing about the wrong things and either regulating or bureaucratizing or drowning in superstition, things that have worked for humanity in the past, and I do worry about that. Yeah, somebody's got to keep the engine of innovation going if we're going to see living standards go on rising.
Yes, I very much agree on that. So I'm going to leave you for your day in Reykjavík, Iceland. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your great work. It's a massive catalog you have already, and I think the effect you have on the public discussion internationally, obviously, is quite considerable.
Thank you. Well, I love this country. It's a beautiful country, and it's got wonderful people in it, and I'm always love the chance to visit.
Yes, thank you. Svo mörg voru þau orð frá Matt Ridley. Þakka ykkur kærlega fyrir samfylgdina í dag, kæru hlustendur og kæru áhorfendur og kæru lesendur eftir atvikum. Ég minni á samstarfsaðila ritstjórans Þótt Þorgrímsson, Myntkaup, Happy Hydrate og Reykjavík Foto. Ég minni einnig á kjörorð fréttaþáttarins sem eru ást á ættjörðu, ást á sannleika. Að öðru leyti bið ég að heilsa og ég bið Guð að blessa ykkur.